introduction. Ah, you have internet on.
I have internet.
Okay. Our today's guest is Dr. Samo Tomsic from Berlin Humboldt University, author of the path-breaking book, The Capitalist Unconscious, on Marx and Lacan. There are many appraisals of the book. I won't read all of them, from Alenka Tomsic to Slavoj Žižek and Benjamin Noyes. You can buy the copy for sure next year, or already now it's on order?
It should be already available.
And it is the first systematic study of the relation of Lacan and Marx. We will hear about it probably also in your talk a little bit what you mean by homology. Yesterday we already had a book presentation about 98 weeks. I think some of you at least were there. Today's talk, though, is called On Repression. I won't read out the abstract again. A couple of words about Samo. Samo is based in Berlin at the Humboldt University. His main research is on psychoanalysis, or philosophical reading of psychoanalysis in, we can already call it, a tradition of the Slovenian school of psychoanalysis, and the combination of the philosophy of German idealism, 19th century continental thought, and psychoanalysis, mainly channeled through the works of Freud, Lacan, Marx, Hegel, Kant, good old classics. And you were before a researcher at the Jan van Eyck Academy, which was an important place where in continental thought, in Central Europe, in Maastricht, this reading, this certain interpretation, reading of Freud and Lacan was developed in the mid and late 2000s years. And by the way, don't miss the conference next week. Two of the main protagonists of the so-called Troika, of the Ljubljana school of psychoanalysis, are coming. Mellon and Alenka Tomsic. So, without further ado, the floor is now yours, Sam. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Sami, for this introduction and for inviting me to Beirut. It is really an amazing time that I've had here. I will present some sort of a melange of thesis on the problematic of repression in psychoanalysis, and also it will be an attempt to continue addressing the questions that Anne has already discussed in her presentation 2 days ago on the relation between Foucault and Lacan. Only that I will focus more on Freud's Freud's theorization of repression mechanisms. Basically, the paper is divided in two parts, where in the first one it's more generalities, what could be the importance of psychoanalysis for political debates in the broadest sense, and then in the second part I kind of take up the basically also some of the developments that are in the book regarding the repression, and try to make some further or reformulations, further contextualizations. So let's just start. Repression, resistance, conflict, prohibition, censorship, protest. From the very beginning, Freud's descriptions of the mental apparatus, of its mechanisms and its mode of functioning, was marked by a vocabulary which openly refers to a conflictual reality, split and alienation. And one can say that just as Marx's image of social reality, Freud's picture of our psychic life is not painted in rosy colors. Already his earliest writings, dating back to in the mid-1890s, Freud would speak of the so-called psychoneurosis of defense, thereby designating notably obsession and hysteria, but also paranoia. He thereby initiated a major critical shift, which would soon amount to a systematic demystification of mental illnesses, disorders, as today's nexus of cognitivist and pharmaceutical ideology prefers to call them. Freud fundamentally challenged the commonplace divide of the normal and the pathological in the realm of thinking, and we can take the association of neurosis and defense seriously, if we take this association of neurosis and defense seriously, considering them as modes of subjective resistance or protest. The immediate question arises, what do these maladies resist against? What do these neurotic subjects protest against? Freud provided a systematic answer in his mature work, implicitly already in his interpretation of dreams. Most openly, of course, and you know this, most openly he addresses this problematic in his late political pessimistic essay, Civilization and Its Discontent. So, neurosis is there most openly understood as a social symptom, an inevitable, even if potentially unintended side product of civilization, of its wars, conflicts, and exploitation, a massive collateral damage which was condemned to silence until the invention of what the first psychoanalytic patient, Anna O. or Berta Pappenheim, named the talking cure. You know this expression. So epistemologically speaking, psychoanalysis stands for a paradigm shift of, from what Foucault called the medical gaze to the paradigm of what we can easily call the analytic ear. Consequently, with Freud's method, neurosis begins to speak, ça parle, as Lacan said. It utters its discontent and protest, albeit in a confusing, scattered, codified way. And Freud recognized in this uttering something that addresses the very truth of the social condition these subjects live in. This is also why, at one point, Lacan distinguished between an organized symptom, for instance, a workers' strike or student protest, etc., and a particular symptom, where the intersubjective mass organization is still lacking. And the task of psychoanalysis evidently consists not only in treating this private sphere, but precisely to mobilize or to organize this symptom in a way. One could even understand psychoanalysis as a form of organization, if one pushes this direction a bit further. This was, for instance, an attempt that Lacan made with his understanding of the psychoanalytic school. It was supposed to be basically an organization with very explicit political goals. And it is no surprise that in about the same period when he spoke about the social symptom, Lacan made the notorious claim according to which the task of psychoanalysis consisted in searching for an exit from the capitalist discourse for everyone, thereby inverting the relations of domination that characterize this modern form of mastery. So if psychoanalysis is an inversion, a flip side, an envers of the master's discourse, as we read in Seminar 17, which took place in the immediate aftermath of May 68. This immediately implies that we need to place it within the framework of the critical and materialist tradition, and consequently understand it as a systematic attempt to overcome the mode of enjoyment imposed by capitalism. But let's make here some steps back. There is yet another imminently social implication of Freud's theories, and it is to be found in the interpretation of dreams, an oeuvre in which Freud provided his first systematic outline of his theory of the unconscious. The volume contains, and one should repeat this again and again, a groundbreaking epistemological cut, or as Freud himself indicated in the epigraph of the book, a repetition of the modern scientific revolution, usually labeled as Copernican, but actually be more precise and call it Galilean, in the so-called netherworld. Now you can laugh at my Latin, flectere sinequo supero sapironta movem. If I cannot deflect the will of heaven, then I shall move hell. It's a quote from Virgil's Aeneid. So Freud broke notably with philosophy whose thematization of the unconscious can be traced all the way to Descartes. However, the philosophical tradition understood the unconscious as some sort of diminished, weakened level of consciousness inhabited by unclear representations, a lack of light, so to speak, and a hidden depth of psychic life. With Schopenhauer, whom Freud occasionally named his predecessor, the unconscious obtained ontological dimensions, and even the features that Freud addressed through the notion of the drive. Recall, for instance, the notion of the unconscious will in Schopenhauer. Nonetheless, there is something missing in these pre-psychoanalytic notions of the unconscious. The topological model implied by these theories is grounded on a vertical relation of surface and depth. And above all, the unconscious is understood as a negative of consciousness, a dark periphery where the light of consciousness does not illuminate the space of thinking. For these various philosophical takes on the problematic, consciousness remains the center of mental life, or one could even say of the metaphysical soul. We should take the word literally. The pre-Freudian notion of the unconscious was psychological, i.e. embedded in an epistemic regime which posits the soul as its privileged object of inquiry, psyche. This is what psychology essentially meant since Aristotle, a science of the soul, so a science of consistency of mental apparatus. Freud, however, changes the object and codifies this change in the very name he coins for his discipline in order to delimit it from psychology. Psychoanalysis is not a science of the soul, it's not a logos of the psyche. It is its dissolution, it is an analysis of psyche. And if we return again to the well-known Freudian claim which associates psychoanalysis with the revolutionary sequence of scientific modernities, Copernicus, Darwin, and Freud himself, not really modest, but we can conclude that the dissolution of the soul rigorously reveals the constitutively alienated and decentralized character of thinking. Nothing displays this decentralization better than a neurosis, where the ego is most openly a powerless interplay of forces that Freud associates with heterogeneous mental instances, the id and the superego, for instance. So the ego would be this sort of surface, this battleground on which conflict takes place. And it's not a coincidence that Freud, towards the end of his life, even most openly started writing of the splitting of the ego in defense mechanisms. So really recognizing what Lacan later theorized as the split or the barred subject. So consciousness is a facade, a surface, but behind this surface there is no deeper, darker realm of mental kingdom. And as soon as we are dealing with a decentralized model of thought, of thinking, we need to represent it in terms of curved surfaces and include the unconscious into this surface that appears to us as conscious thought. So in Freud, this conclusion is not yet entirely univocal. He still speaks of deep psychology and Seelenleben, so mental life, but literally soul life, so he even uses the notion of the soul metaphysical notion. It was only Lacan who accomplished the rigorous theorization of all subversive epistemological, philosophical, and political consequences of the Freudian invention of psychoanalysis, and who also provided the appropriate topological didactic tools which were supposed to visualize the spatial temporal paradoxes that psychoanalysis encounters in the structure of thinking. For instance, one can name the most obvious one that Lacan was using over and over again, the Mobius strip. This was a central model. I guess you all know the Mobius strip, a one-sided surface, which has an effect of a flip side, but it's actually not there. So with this didactic apparatus, the conclusion is at hand that the unconscious is a disturbance, an anomaly, a distortion of the surface of thinking, a distortion, however, that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere in the space of thinking, or as Lacan would say, everywhere and nowhere in language. There is yet another crucial epistemological feature of the Freudian conceptualization of the unconscious, which was already, for him, immediately linked with social structures and mechanisms. Freud very consequently spoke of the mental apparatus, so the accent is on the apparatus, referred to the conceptual language of energetics in order to explain the functioning of this mental machinery, and it is no chance that the longest chapter in the interpretation of dreams is dedicated to what Freud calls Traumarbeit, dream work or dream labor. So in his work, Freud systematically and consequently speaks of different forms and achievements of this unconscious labor. I already mentioned dream labor, but we also find condensation labor, displacement labor, joke labor, even mourning labor. Analysis itself is described with the expression working through, durcharbeiten. And finally, there is probably the most significant achievement of the unconscious labor, namely the repression labor, to which I'll return in an instant. So, what's the point here? If the unconscious is marked significantly by labor, then this labor must be productive. And what it is supposed to produce, I mean, can ask, but Freud gave sort of an interesting but at the same time strikingly banal answer. What it produces is lust, pleasure, or as Lacan would later translate it, enjoyment, jouissance. It is therefore misleading to speak of the mental apparatus, since we then obtain the image of a blind mechanism. It would be much more appropriate to speak of the unconscious factory, whose end products, like dreams, jokes, slips of the tongue, all these tiny border phenomena that Freud analyzes in his first great monographies, are marked by the fact that they all have a value of enjoyment, so that there is something that something enjoys by appropriating them, by having them produced. So they are supposed to satisfy an unconscious tendency for which Freud claims that it's in the state of repression, a tendency for which Freud then also proposed two different but still interconnected names. Wunsch, wish, but it would be more appropriate to say desire, and Trieb, drive. So we slowly approach the central critical point of Freud's theories of the unconscious, for this libidinal economy was for Freud not detached from social structures. As I've already recalled, Freud was from the very offset treating neurosis as phenomena which were enunciating something about the broader environment, their social political milieu in which these phenomena emerged. And in the interpretation of dreams, Freud not only placed unconscious labor at the heart of his scientific preoccupations, he also, and above all, proposed the following analogy, which was supposed to make his theories more understandable, more graspable. more concrete for the audience of medicines and philosophers that were so critical toward his assumptions about the nature of thinking. So here's a quote from the interpretation of dreams, which I'm making a lot of noise about also in the book. It's really, and I find it really fascinating. So here it goes. The motive force which the dream required had to be provided by wish. It was the business of the worry to get hold of a wish to act as the motive force of the dream. The position may be explained by an analogy. A daytime thought may very well play the part of entrepreneur for a dream, but the entrepreneur, who, as people say, has the idea and the initiative to carry it out, can do nothing without the capital. He needs a capitalist who can afford the outlay, and the capitalist who provides the psychical outlet for the dream is invariably and indisputably, whatever may be the thoughts of the previous day, a wish from the unconscious. So this is the end of quote. One could say, okay, here we have it. Freud is a liberal, homo economicus, entrepreneurship, but not quite. It's really the question of labor that is central. So that we are dealing with more than mere an innocent analogy can be concluded from the fact that Freud was very proud of it. The same passage is quoted 5 years later in the Dora case and recollected in the introductory lectures to, on psychoanalysis 15 years after the interpretation of dreams. The analogy between the libidinal economy and the political economy seems to have remained stuck in Freud's mind, accompanying him throughout his work, and we can claim that the two direct critical political implications can be formulated in the following way. So the first one would be, thinking the unconscious in terms of productive labor characterizes Freud's theory as a labor theory of the unconscious. And I'm consciously formulating this in parallel to Marx's labor theory of value, which goes well beyond the banal claim that labor is the source of all value. That was actually the political economic assumption that Marx already criticized for its insufficiency. For Marx, the organization of labor takes place on the background of a fetishist fantasy, the infamous Geld heckendes Geld, money breeding money, which drives all levels of social production. So the main Marxian thesis on the source of value would rather be fantasy plus labor, or fantasy plus organization of labor, fetishism plus exploitation. And we say that Freud proposed a labor theory of the unconscious, or even a labor theory of enjoyment, then it is because for him too, fantasies, for instance infantile fantasies, played the central structuring role in the striving for enjoyment, in the driving, they're driving the unconscious mechanisms to incessant labor. Ça travaille, to paraphrase Lacan. And the second claim with regard to Freud's theory of the unconscious consists not simply in uncovering the capitalist character of the unconscious, since this would push psychoanalysis in an unwanted ahistoricism, and also claim that we can't basically get out of capitalism, which would be a tricky endeavor to make, and wouldn't have anything to do with the critical tradition that Freud and Lacan was moving in. But rather, the dependency of the unconscious on the same structures and logical mechanisms that constitute the social reality. So this sounds much more reasonable. In other words, on the predominant discourse or social link. And we can see immediately that if neurosis is a social symptom rather than a private matter of economic subjects, then we could also recognize in it an effort to sabotage the unconscious labor process, a subjective attempt of going on strike. Neurosis is a protest against the imperatives that govern this unconscious factory. Now, following this line, we can see that psychoanalysis never really fitted in the image that the critical voices of post-structuralism, such as Deleuze and Guattari on the one hand, or Foucault on the other, have coined in the early to mid-70s. In his Will to Knowledge, his anti-psychoanalytic manifesto, which was supposed to inaugurate the 6-volume project of A History of Sexuality, or as Foucault also puts it, archaeology of psychoanalysis, Freud is associated with what Foucault calls a repressive hypothesis. So a hypothesis according to which human sexuality, desire, drive, and so on, is considered as something that is socially repressed in the sense of oppression. We all know that Foucault opposes to this simple idea, which surely echoes in some of Freud's early writings on the link between bourgeois sexual morality and the proliferation of nervous illnesses, to a more sophisticated situation in which sexuality is something that was fabricated by the nexus of power mechanisms and scientific knowledge in the age of classicism. By the time Freud invented psychoanalysis, so Foucault, sexuality was already fully constituted as an epistemic object, as an object of scientia sexualis, sexual science or science of sex, in the frameworks of which psychoanalysis found its conditions of possibility. So it was simply continuing this epistemic development. But as we know, and this is where Foucault's critique of repression enters the picture, for Foucault, modernity is marked by a process that amounted to a groundbreaking transformation of power, something that we can call the decentralization of power. Not only is power no longer embodied, personified in the figure of the sovereign, but also and above all, no longer exercised in a hierarchic manner from above. It takes place in complex networks of interconnections. It is capillary micropower. So we have to speak more of the effects of power rather than its localization in a higher instance. And because of this, the repressive hypothesis, according to Foucault, gets things wrong. Sexuality is not a pre-existing substance which is subsequently subjected to power relations. It is itself an inherent ingredient of power and a result, basically, a fabrication of the collaboration of capitalist power and modern scientific knowledge. Now, this is actually not that foreign to psychoanalysis, in fact, with the difference that for Freud there is an immediate link between repression and production of sexuality, which enables to preserve the conflictual reality in the picture, precisely this structural negativity that Marx addressed with the notion of class struggle, the radical absence, inexistence of an underlying social relation on which the predominant mode of production grounds its fantasies, such as the liberal idea of economic contract between free and competitive economic men, or the neoliberal idea of spontaneous self-regulation of the market, as well as the presumably harmonious effects of a radical pursuit of the narcissistic self-interest or of austerity. For Freud, on the contrary, the entire situation is much more complicated, and I would like to outline this complexity by focusing on his very sophisticated analysis of the mechanisms of satisfaction of drives. So Freud claims that no immediate, no direct satisfaction of the drive is possible, and he locates the reason for this impossibility in repression, or better, in the necessity of labor, since repression is nothing other than a form, maybe the key form of unconscious labor. Basically, repression means that satisfaction has to be and can be obtained only through the process of labor, only through mediation. One could say money, commodity, money. Okay, so here's a quote from Freud's book on jokes. It is our belief that culture and higher education have a large influence on the development of repression, and we suppose that under such conditions the psychical organization undergoes an alteration, as a result of which what was formerly felt as agreeable now seems unacceptable and is rejected with all possible psychical force. The repression labor of civilization brings it about that primary possibilities of enjoyment which we have now, however, being repudiated by the censorship in us, are lost to us, unquote. So this is from 1905, and it immediately echoes the repressive hypothesis. On the one hand, the labor of repression, which serves higher tendencies striving to preserve the cultural ideas and institutions, and on the other, the originary yet excluded jouissance, the immediate possibilities of enjoyment, which had to be abandoned in favor of cultural progress. So cultural phenomena that Freud analyzes, for instance, jokes, create the impression of bypassing the prohibition or the cultural obstacle and regaining a part of this lost and forbidden jouissance. So, indeed, this quote entirely supports Freud's criticism. And why is that? It's because Freud places the existence of the drive before culture, thereby formulating some sort of hypothesis of an enjoyment before enjoyment, an originary enjoyment which was subsequently prohibited and mortified by the intervention of the law. And we can recall that Freud's later theoretical endeavors tried to embody this hypothetical jouissance in the mythological figure of the primordial father. But basically what he did with this figure is not resolve any dilemmas that concern the problematic of jouissance. It merely brought together all the paradoxes of the actual existing libidinal economy in one hypothetical character, because the sons are already in the regime of prohibition, and the father is the exception that has access to some full enjoyment. Now, Lévi-Strauss and Lacan have already recognized in this tale of originary patricide that takes place then once the sons have enough of this paternal terror, that Freud adopted from, so they saw in this originary patricide a scientific myth that Freud adopted from the ethnological and evolutionary context. But in Freud's case, this myth becomes a curious structural equivalent of what Marx strived to address under the notion of primitive accumulation. So a historic fiction which strives to outline the genesis of present-day antagonisms in the subjective and social reality, but not going to go into that. One of the main achievements of Lacan in his return to Freud consisted in reaffirming the primacy of repression in terms of productive labor over the repressed, thereby providing the necessary ground for distinguishing repression from suppression and or oppression. For instance, in the following passage from television. Let's say, this is a quote from Lacan, let's say that Freud leaned more towards the idea that repression was primary, that on the whole is what tipped the scales towards the second topography. So the second topography is here meant like the id, the ego, and the superego division of the mental apparatus. So continue the quote. The greediness by which he characterizes the superego is structural. This is important. So the greediness by which he characterizes the superego is structural, not an effect of civilization, but discontent, symptom in civilization. So that's why we have to re-examine the test case, thinking as a starting point the fact that it is repression that produces suppression. Why couldn't the family, society itself, be creations built from repression? They are nothing less. That, however, may be because the unconscious exists, is motivated by the structure, that is, by language. Unquote. So here we have the classical Lacan. The intervention of language is an equivalent to what Freud addressed as Urverdrängung, originary repression, primal repression. And this intervention is productive. It produces the drives, it produces sexuality, and it produces this entire complication in their satisfaction. At this point, it might be necessary to recall the basic points of Freud's understanding of repression. He understands it as a compromise procedure, a middle-ding, intermediate thing between escape and condemnation, so far from what Foucault saw in repression, which already deprives it of the exclusively negative connotation. It neither avoids the repressed tendency nor refuses its satisfaction. The central question is why the tendency is repressed in the first place, and the spontaneous answer would most likely be that its satisfaction would cause unpleasure, to be uncomfortable. And this is precisely not the case for Freud. Here is another quote from his later text on drives and its vicissitudes. A necessary condition of its happening must clearly be that the drive's attainment of its aim should produce unpleasure instead of pleasure, but we cannot well imagine such a contingency. There are no such drives. Satisfaction of a drive is always pleasurable. We should have to assume certain peculiar circumstances, some sort of process by which the pleasure of satisfaction is changed into unpleasure, unquote. So in the naturalistic context, the drive stands for a bodily need which can be traced back to physiological mechanisms. Trieb is taken out of basically energetics and then thematized various natural sciences before entering psychology. Freud accordingly distinguishes between drives that point to a quasi-natural need, for instance, hunger and thirst. This was probably the reason why Trieb was initially translated as instinct into English and into French. And this has kind of hegemonized the understanding in other languages. So a quasi-natural need where repression is out of the question, and drives that deviate from this apparently natural satisfaction are subjected to repression. In this category, Freud situated sexuality. So you have drives where you can't repress. You have to eat if you're hungry, you have to drink if you're thirsty, but you don't have to have sex if you're horny. That's the entire point of psychoanalysis. So let us take the case in which a drive stimulus, such as hunger, remains unsatisfied. It then becomes imperative and can be allied by nothing but the action that satisfies it. It keeps up a constant tension of need. Nothing in the nature of a repression seems in this case to come remotely into question. In this psychological sense, hence in relation to the preservation of organism, the drive is entirely reducible to the need and cannot become the target of repression. Sorry, I'm repeating myself a bit. It can be satisfied only by corresponding action, eating, drinking, and so on. So the drive that demands the labor of repression is something else. It's too symbolic to be biological or psychological. This and nothing else is the meaning of Freud's claim that the drive, quote, appears to us as a concept on the frontier between the mental and the somatic, unquote. Or, quote, the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind, unquote. Entire ontological problematics here. This careful placement of the drive, neither psychological nor physiological, sufficiently indicates that Freud aims beyond the classical mind-body dualism without therefore slipping into a vitalist monism. The drive is the border that from within traverses and splits the body on the physiological and the libidinal, so two materialities. So that we are dealing with some sort of conflictual monism, including negativity, and this negativity is precisely the drive. Or the negativity is that of a representation which brings then the causality of the signifier, the primacy of language that Lacan's quote from television talked about into the picture. So, an internal border which makes the biological equivocal with the linguistic As such border, the drive remains a bodily phenomenon and even appears indistinguishable from the need it translates or represents. Fusing a physiological stimulus with its representation, the drive becomes a material echo of linguistic autonomy, the autonomy of representation. But it is also what the intervention of the signifier isolates in the tendencies of the organism towards self-preservation, in all the stimuli that come from the body. Freud inquiries circulate around this epistemological deadlock. Because the echo is too material, it cannot be declared an idealist entity or a scientific fiction, but because its satisfaction seems to cause unpleasure, which is not the case with physiological needs, something violates the mechanisms of satisfaction. So this scandal in the end exposes the minimal gap between the drive and the need, the organic need. The drive is the symbolic isolation of their demand, the imperative for satisfaction that they contain. It takes it out. Detached from its repetitive and rhythmic organic context, the demand for satisfaction assumes a life of its own, and this is where the unpleasurable aspect of satisfaction enters the picture. So basically the drive doesn't seem to be satisfied. It just demands. It doesn't have a rhythm. Certainly, the drive is a hypothesis which strives to account for the fact that the apparatus of the signifier does not follow useful goals, the satisfaction of needs, but tends toward what Freud called immediate pleasure gain, Lustgewinn, which kind of brings the notion of enjoyment as profit, as surplus into the picture. The drive names the tendency that accounts for a series of material consequences of representation without therefore appearing before the analyst's eyes as a positive substance. So another quote from Freud. In our work we cannot for a moment disregard them, yet we are never sure that we are seeing them clearly, unquote. It's a phantomic entity. Its hypothesis is indispensable, but one can never confront it directly, only observe its consequences. First and foremost, the conversions of pleasure into unpleasure. The manifestation of physiological needs additionally blurs the visibility of the drive, or better put, because all the bodily needs are channeled through the drive and their privileged representation. They no longer remain unproblematic. No act of eating, no act of drinking, no act of copulation is innocent once you have the drive. So in this respect, the drive is the paradigmatic case of the pun that Freud uses in his book on jokes, traduttore, traditore, translator, traitor. It represents, so it translates, the apparently natural need in an unfaithfully productive way, thereby betraying its satisfaction. The translation produces a change in the status of pleasure. There is no drive, the satisfaction of which would not cause pleasure, although this pleasure is no longer an affect that accompanies the decrease of tension. So if you are hungry, you have an unpleasurable feeling, you eat, you feel pleasure, because the tension decreases. The pleasure that can be associated with the satisfaction of hunger is different from the pleasure that clings to the act of eating. The intertwining of the two imperatives, the need for to eat and the demand of the drive that clings on this act of eating, conceals the fact that the demand of the drive is a constant one, that it repeats the imperative of satisfaction beyond the need. You cannot ever stop eating. You overeat, or you displace your oral pleasure from talking, smoking, drinking, eating, oral sex, etc. Bare instinctual life is an imaginary representation of what takes place behind the apparent satisfaction of physiological needs, the persistence of the imperative beyond every attempt of satisfaction. This feature of the drive did not go unnoticed in Freud. A quote, "A drive never operates as a force giving a momentary impact, but always as a constant one," unquote. So again, no rhythm, no, it's only repetition, only constant force. The detachment of the imperative from a concrete reference and consequently the autonomy of the demand, which depends on the autonomy of the signifier, places the drive in discrepancy with every supposedly natural or instinctual need. And due to its persistence, the drive's constant force can only be experienced as unpleasure. More precisely, and this is a quote from Freud, this is wonderful, "Lust, die nicht als solche empfunden werden kann, pleasure that cannot be felt as such, or pleasure that cannot be experienced as pleasure, or that can be only experienced as unpleasure." With this formulation, Freud actually provides the best definition of what Lacan was targeting with his notion of jouissance. In the need, this pleasure precedes satisfaction. In the drive, this pleasure accompanies satisfaction and is the privileged manifestation of pleasure. So satisfaction now takes place in the increase of tension, and this tension is due to the insatiable drang, pressure, which is common to all drives. Freud says that it's even their essence. So basically, to translate it into Lacanese, we could say the drive as a representation of physiological needs come down to the imperative signifier, to the S1, the repressed signifier of enjoyment. So it's no, I have to skip a bit. It's no surprise that in this constellation, Freud then also detects what he calls a constant demand for labor, Arbeitsanforderung. So in the imperative for enjoyment that the drive comes down to, there is also simultaneously in the same imperative a demand for labor. So basically one could say, when Lacan says the imperative of the superego is enjoy, you could also say the imperative of the superego is work. So kind of comes close to the societies we live in. So again, one point regarding the difference between the need and the demand, we can also, it repeats itself on the level of the object. Unlike need, which has a very concrete object, the drive appears to be without one. Here's another quote by Freud. The object of a drive is the thing in regard to which or through which the drive is able to achieve its aim. It's what is most variable about the drive and is not originally connected with it, but becomes assigned to it only in consequence of being peculiarly fitted to make satisfaction possible, unquote. Basically, you can think, if you know the passage from Lacan's Seminar 11, where he speaks of the drive as a montage of heterogeneous objects that are just thrown together in order to keep the drive going. So basically, the drive would be this force that brings objects together, modifies their constellation, and moves on to the next constellation, and that's it. So let's now turn to the paradoxes of repression that Foucault failed to notice in his own critique of psychoanalysis. Freud most openly writes that repression is not an originary defense mechanism, but can only become operative once a split between conscious and unconscious mental activity has already been established. So there is no repression without the unconscious already being there. And its function does not consist in suppressing, inhibiting, or hindering satisfaction, but in keeping the drive away from consciousness. Here is basically then the question: how did it come to this constellation? And Freud then introduces this well-known hypothesis that there had to be a first step of repression, a primal repression, which brought this entire constellation into being, and then all the actual repression, or what we have here and now, is a second stage, whereby the first stage produced the drive, and the second one is basically only working on its satisfaction. Sorry, I have to skip again a bit so it won't take too long. This torture. Let us go to this longer Freudian quote where all these paradoxes of repression are brought together, where we can also see which things Foucault does not take into account. So here's a longer quote. The second stage of repression, repression proper, affects, and this is now important, mental derivatives of the repressed representative, or such trains of thought as originating elsewhere have come into associative connection with it. On account of this association, these ideas experience the same fate as what was originally repressed. Repression proper, therefore, is actually an after-pressure, Nachdrängen. Moreover, and this is where Freud differs from Foucault. If it would be only an after-pressure, a Nachdrängen, we would have this vertical relation of repression in terms of oppression. But Freud continues. Moreover, it is a mistake to emphasize only the repulsion, which operates from the direction of the conscious upon what is to be repressed. Quite as important is the attraction exercised by what was originally repressed upon everything with which it can establish a connection. Probably the trend towards repression would fail in its purpose if these two forces did not cooperate, if there were not something previously repressed ready to receive what is repelled by the conscious. Basically, there are no two forces. It's one force that is internally broken, that has a structure of a parallax, and depending on which side we stand, we see the two consequences. And basically, what Foucault calls repressive hypothesis can only be articulated from the position of consciousness, where repression appears as a repulsion. If we take Freud's position, this would be the impossible position of psychoanalysis, the position of the unconscious. Not the position of the drive, but the position of the unconscious. Then you see the parallax, the impossible point from which the parallax is visible, where you see that repression is basically a two-way street. An imperative goes up, it attracts, it's a gravitational force. And, of course, something is shuffled apparently down, but it's not going down. It's some sort of structural curvature that is at stake, rather than an upside down relation. So we can speak of the constitutive repression in Freud and the constituted repression. The constitutive repression is what produces the drive, and this is where Freud can do hypothetical speculation how this constitutive repression came into being. Lacan's thesis, as we've heard, was, well, it was because of the intervention of language. The constituted repression is the state here and now where the mental apparatus labors and thereby produces a satisfaction that is displeasurable for the subject. And in a way, one could reproach to Foucault that that in his critique of psychoanalysis, he neglected precisely this crucial insight of psychoanalysis into the nature of jouissance, that there is something deeply troubling, something deeply, well, as Freud said, discontent, something Unbehagen, that there is a constitutive Unbehagen in Genießen, a discontent in enjoyment. But that doesn't mean that what Foucault called the repressive hypothesis does not exist. It exists especially today in times of aggressive neoliberalism. Did not neoliberal ideology constantly turn around the idea that the market contains creative potentials which need to be liberated through deregulation? The concept of the free market basically mobilizes the repressive hypothesis through which capitalism perverts and neutralizes, for instance, what was still the political radicality of modern liberation movements, which were not talking about repression anyhow, they were talking about oppression. So it's a different agenda anyhow. So basically, only from the position of the subject, which is in the position of Freud's labor theory, that Freud's labor theory of the unconscious posits, and from the position of Marx's critique of fetishism, can repression appear as an operation that conditions the satisfaction of the drive through the double production of the surplus object and of the alienated subject in a concrete form. Basically, what again it was troubling Foucault was that there is a theory of the subject involved in the Freudian notion of repression, which is deeply anchored in negativity. But this is also basically a subject that is common to critique of political economy, and if we want to call psychoanalysis a critique of libidinal economy, a subject that these two critical sciences or these two critical thought systems are striving to mobilize, not in order to now abolish repression, but in order to somehow, how to put it, well, in order to create the conditions of possibility of a political subjectivity to counteract and to transform basically the social regime, which now in this condition, because Freud provided some sort of general framework that seems to be ahistorical, but we have to consider it in this present condition. In this present condition, this would mean that the process that produces the subject detaches it from the imperative to produce value, well, basically to produce surplus as value. Well, I mean, here I guess there is an entire set of complications and unclarities. I guess we can pass over to the debate, because I've been speaking way too long and been jumping back and forth in the paper. So rather address these issues together, and I will stop talking here. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have roughly 20 minutes for a debate, for comments, clarification, questions.
Can we have an example, if it's possible, for, let's say, the difference between Foucault's position and a more Lacanian position on the point of the neglect of repression? The question is, how does it matter on a concrete example?
The take on repression.
Yeah. Foucault neglected repression.
Yeah.
He only took it as a conscious enunciation, or as a conscious repression.
Yeah.
And
No.
how does it matter on a kind of in an example?
Well, let's go to the 90s. No, not the 90s. The 70s. This was, or basically, let's go to the 60s. Because this entire conflict around repression, I think, started or intensified at least with the May '68 movements, at least in the French context. The liberation movements, liberation of sexuality, emancipation of different sexual orientations, and so on and so forth, basically is an example where we can, of course, talk about repression in terms of oppression, because they are. I mean, there is a very concrete case of oppression being made on, or every minority can serve as an example. But the problem here is that if you only remain on the level of oppression, you overlook what happens once this oppression has been the abolition of this oppression has been politically achieved. In a way, it has been the case that a certain radicality of liberation movements has been successfully integrated into what Marcuse, for instance, called the one-dimensional man, or to put it bluntly, there was an emergence of something like identity politics, which is, in a way, another form of repression. It's a repression through commodification. Now, this is the point that I was trying to make, but didn't succeed in making at the end of the paper. If you only observe this perspective of consciousness, where repression works from higher instances to lower and oppresses them, you miss out on a complexity which concerns precisely further the afterlife of emancipation within capitalism. And yeah, I guess I'm not the only one who's not really fond of identity politics, because this is precisely radicalism for capitalist times. This is the radicalism that functions perfectly within. Well, if we take now Western societies, it's no longer, to have an identity is nothing particularly subversive. To disidentify, to actually target the level where a political subjectivity which has no predicate is subversive. Well, could be subversive.
Just one comment, if I understand. So Foucault supports anti-oppression politics, which leads to identification to certain form of, let's say, sexuality or whatever. And this is what I understood. And what would be the alternative? If first, is it correct what I understood?
Well, Foucault was very successfully integrated into what has become then labeled identity politics, or gender studies. All the disciplines which are embedded in an industry of knowledge, but behind the facade of a political or epistemic radicality, basically operate within a more general framework.
What is the alternative?
What is the alternative? Well, again, the alternative would be to think as a subjectivity that is disidentified, that is not anchored in an identity. This would be kind of then a narcissistic politics. To each one identity, and each basically pursues its private interests when it comes to his or her own identity. So basically, identitarian politics operates with a highly narcissistic subject. I would claim. Alternative, we still have a signifier for this alternative. Marx proposed it. It's called communist politics, and the communist politics is precisely a politics, the subject of which not only does not have an identity, does not have a human face. So it's not a psychological subject. It goes further in the exploration also of the idea what is the subject of politics than any democratic or identitarian politics has done, because these politics make a stop. They come to an anchoring point in a sexual identity or gender or ethnicity or whatever, So they
This was the worst. This is great. This is great. We are on the right track. Identity politics. It comes back in 30 seconds.
Okay. No, but Lacan said for utilitarian, when he was commenting on utilitarianism in Seminar 20, we should not abandon old words. We should stick to them because they might appear of some use. Which is actually quite funny comment to make on utilitarianism. But we can not that funny. But we can actually, we must actually insist even more on the ongoing relevance of what the signifier communism might entail for our happy critical times. If we can make some use of utilitarianism, I think we should make even more use of the political signifier communism beyond the failed attempts that have so far stained this notion. This precisely, and this is what one always then encounters in the debate, that the signification of communism is simply anchored in the criminal regimes that have proposed their own variants of communism. And if we give up that this is it, okay, alternative is Stalinism. Of course, no one would say that Stalinism is an alternative. But I guess many of us would say that Stalinism is not representative for communism. Marx, on the other hand, is, for me personally, someone who had an intelligent idea about what communism is supposed to be, precisely because he had no idea.
A couple of comments. I really appreciate what you're doing with Freud on repression, bringing up that two-way street. And it's a beautiful analogy of the parallax and the impossible position. And in some ways, only psychoanalysis I have to go to, which is like step into the unconscious and look at it from the point of view of the attractors in the unconscious. I really appreciate that. Also, again, just a comment, in a sense, so the term repressive hypothesis, we should sort of rephrase that in a sense, which is repression exists, so it's no longer a hypothesis. Right? In certain circumstances, repression really does exist. So it's no longer the repressive hypothesis, it's there.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the example that you gave.
Yeah.
But then also, you have to say, in terms of the critique that Foucault makes of Freud's repressive hypothesis, Freud would agree with that. And it's in the sense that you don't, what Foucault doesn't like about the repressive hypothesis is the notion that once it's there, you think, oh, you're just going to say no to the repression, and you believe that you're going to get something else.
Yeah.
So Freud agrees with that. He's not saying you can just.
No, of course.
So that's falsely ascribed.
Yeah.
So I agree with you completely on that.
No, of course. I mean, basically, when one reads the first volume of History of Sexuality, Foucault claims something that seems to come very close to Lacan. I mean, this thesis that sexuality or that sex is an invention of the age of classicism and so on and so forth. But where the two differ is that Lacan is a dialectical materialist and Foucault is not. So, in a way, it's understandable why Foucault could be so successfully mobilized for the theories of performativism and so on. Because, in a way, he never makes clear that even if it is a fabrication of a discourse, sexuality still assumes the status of as Lacan would say, and as Aleka Zupancic has elaborated also extensively, the status of a real discursive consequence. Now, this is the materialism that we do not find in Foucault nowhere, not in the earlier works, not in the later works, which also makes sense why he was opposed to Marx, because you have to then deal with a much more complex set of negativities also that concern the social realm. I mean, for Marx, it's not so. For Marx, power is also not something that is centralized. In a way, one could easily associate Marx with the Foucauldian reading of the transformation of power in modernity. I mean, Marx analyzes the decentralized power, but for him there is still underlying negativity that splits this power from within.
What is negativity?
What is negativity?
No, the underlying negativity.
Class struggle.
Okay, this is something.
Yeah, I mean, Foucault, I mean, the idea of biopolitics is a complete rejection of the notion of class struggle. I mean, this is the most open polemics that Foucault leads against Marxism. As soon as you have disciplinary power, as soon as you have the problematic of race that he discusses in his seminar on security, territory, and population, I think it was there, and in the notion of, in the birth of biopolitics, in society must be defended, sorry. You have already a different take on social antagonisms. I mean, you kind of seem to disperse and decentralize them just like you disperse and decentralize power, but at the same time, I mean, it doesn't mean that you've done something better. I think you've worsened, you've mystified the situation.
Yeah, but why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because Foucault focuses so strongly on the role of knowledge, especially of modern science, in the constitution and reproduction of modern power relations. Okay, fine, you know, Lacan did that as well with his idea of the university discourse. But, you know, power, it's not just any power, it's very clear from the very offset that we are talking about capitalism, and that capitalism has a certain contradiction. You know, it doesn't just, it's not just a free-floating machine that segregates and that you know, mobilizes subjects and transforms them into biopolitical subjects. It has a contradiction. I mean, okay, we can argue here. You know, Lacan. No, not Lacan. Foucault against Marx. I would always go on the side of Marx and analyze the internal contradictions of this mode of production, and not only focus on the production. You know, I mean, Foucault remains only on the level of production. Knowledge produces a certain subjectivity. Okay, fine, but how does it produce this subjectivity?
I will collect another round of questions. One comment: form. Form would be form of relation, commodity form of certain relations would be probably the key term to see what is missed in Foucault when your power relations, without an understanding of what is the specificity of commodity form.
Mm-hmm.
And if you understand what commodity form is, then you get an idea of antagonism and the historical specificity, and basically your theoretical firewall against, let's say, transcends historical dehistoricizing concepts, which at the same time do not simply historicize from, you know, a meta position. That is why commodity form probably is the key term to be.
Exactly, the commodity form is a contradiction.
Yeah, this is exactly a form that, you know, it's not just when you are in the sandbox and have a form and some sand in it and do it upside down, then you have a beautiful shaped or not beautifully shaped sand cake. No. Okay, I also discuss it and then I was for sure. But you know what I mean, this is not the form. So form would be precisely this kind of contradictory strip, you can even say, that binds together what actually is non-related. So a relation of a non-relation, which, because otherwise antagonism would not be functional. You have class struggle, yet still you have a functional capitalism. This is all in commodity form, which is at the same time the signifier for a specific historical moment, and at the same time the structure, so to speak, that historicizes itself and allows for historical time. So you have a lot of, or other way around, you miss so much when you do not have that you become so easily co-optable as Foucault. And that is probably, it's a different theoretical language for sure, other theoretical questions in the back, Nietzsche and so on. I'm talking too long, I was actually here to collect questions. So please, I saw already one hand, let's move on.
I just want a quick comment, which this discussion, which you about in Marx's chat, there's another angle of called the book Forget Foucault. Who's Foucault?
Oh yeah, Baudrillard.
Yeah, exactly. And one of his, as I recall, one of his comments, the reason that he's saying Forget Foucault is, he says it's a brilliant theory, but the problem with the theory is that it's too strong, right? It doesn't have any resistance inside it. So what Foucault fails to account for is why we're not all perfectly structured as, in terms of biopower and biopolitics. Why aren't we all these machines doing exactly what capitalism says we should be doing? So that's his take on it. It's just like, what's gone wrong in that theory? The theory is predicting too much, which relates to this notion of weirdly enough, no negativity within Foucault.
Well, there is another objection. It's actually quite a cheap one, but I'll say it anyway. That one can address to Foucault or to certain readings of Foucault. I mean, did we really ever have this pre-modern sovereign power, this stability, you know, that had to be that was so vertical and so on? And on the other hand, I mean, we can also flip it around. Do we really have only a decentralized power now? I mean, actually, this is the main point of all Marxist-inspired theories of power, including Lacan. You know that history is basically a history of transformations of the master figure. You know, Lacan says somewhere that the master's discourse is the oldest discourse, and everything else happens later, which doesn't mean that we have, you know, that we have a recipe for the master since the dawn of mankind. Of course, we have different regimes of the master, and there is a certain, in Lacanian jargon, one could probably say, hysterizations of the master always already present. What capitalism successfully mobilizes is precisely this headless character of domination by entirely detaching logic that governs our lives from concrete personifications. I mean, this is also what Marx basically says in the preface to the first volume of Capital. We are not talking here about the capitalist and the laborer as empirical subjects. We are talking about personifications of economic categories. In other words, we are talking about structural reality, which has its administrators, but it presents the power in a slightly different way than Foucault's simple, you know, like, oh, before it was all so centralized and now it's also capillary and micro fiber and so on.
I calculated 3 more minutes, then you have worked enough for your dinner.
The labor of the unconscious never ends.
We can also donate 3 minutes to you if there is no further questions.
Actually, I have a short one.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
You want to make it
We all want to read that.
The hardest blow comes at the end.
I very much liked the reading of the labor of the unconscious and repression, in relation to repression. I'm wondering if, I mean, of course, Marx's ways big there and so on, but I'm wondering whether for Freud there is any historicity to that labor of the unconscious.
That is then also one of these great dilemmas that stick to Freud's theory. In a way, it's actually very simple to reproach, not so much to Lacan, even though we could also do the same reproach to him. But in Freud, it really, the entire human history is a repetition of the same. You know, the originary patricide, everything is over there, nothing changed in a way. Also, when it comes to the question of the drive, and if we take this analogy with capitalism that he makes an interpretation of dream and kind of globalize it, like I was doing, of course, one risks of ending in ahistoric constellation, that basically the drive is the capitalist drive. I don't really think so. I think the situation has been actually, and this is where Marx can help us, because he already solved the dilemma. You know, for him, modernity means a certain transformation of the drive. He talks about the Bereicherungstrieb, the drive for enrichment, which we already find in the figure of the miser. But what capitalism does is basically that it solves a certain deadlock in the drive, in the case of the miser, or Schatzbildner. How do you translate that?
Schatzbildner is you build wealth.
Yeah, well,
hoarder
hoarder of treasure, yeah. Which basically, in the case of the miser, he's taking money out of the circulation and hoards it. So it's basically he's the target of the object, as Mellon put it in his book on the miser. Capitalist is not a target. He's not a hostage of the object. He's basically the social administrator, or the personification, as Marx says. Which basically, instead of hoarding money, he throws money into the circulation in order to get more back. So it's an entirely different realization of the drive, one could say. One can draw a parallel between the miser and the capitalist. Marx also says the capitalist is a rationalized miser. But at the same time, we are not dealing with the same libidinal economy, and we are consequently not dealing with the same drive. So I would be more tempted to read Freud in the direction of a history of the drive, a history of actualizations. Sorry, no, not archaeology. Even though I have a faiblesse for Foucault. There is the best Foucault is in Le Moyle shows. I still think not in his later.
You can say Urgeschichte, primordial history, or non-historicizable historicity of the drive, which is a different form of history other than the one that you can historicize from a meta position. And this is basically always the case when you have these still history, the same as with value or with capital, which appears to be ahistoric and so on. It has, of course, historicity, but you cannot historicize it from, on a plain scale, from a meta position. That's the whole point. But then you need to complicate it with your theoretical language to step out of actus potentia metaphysics. Because otherwise it would be just an actualization of already given potential. But this is exactly the point of a broken flux.
But this is where, of course, the danger of historicity would be, like Sami said, would be there, would be installed if Freud would understand under the drive a positive ontological substance, in the classical sense of the term substance. But he doesn't. We have to really insist on this idea that the drive is a representation of a need. And on Lacan's translation of this, that basically once language intervenes, you have all this set of real consequences. But again, this doesn't say a thing, because the language is also not some meta-reality that doesn't, that is immune to concrete historical constellations. So there is no meta-language means precisely, one could turn this thesis around by saying, okay, there is no meta-language means that language is no meta-position, or that language cannot assume the position in which it is excerpted from historicity.
On this note? If you open another question, not, but only a comment.
Okay. For the exercise of power, so if you take the analysis of Foucault, how power is exercised through space.
Yeah.
the difference between, if you take the intervention of Frank Koolhaas on the panopticon, when he removed the tower, the eyes that observe, do you think it's useful, his micro-analysis on this level? You see what which means that the argument of Foucault would be that in a disciplinary society, the power is based on seeing and not being seen, but in a biopolitical kind of power, the enunciation of power becomes to modulate a living mass. This is why we remove the tower of observation. Do you think that this kind of analysis is useless or useful in any kind? And another remark is that knowledge in Foucault is not, I understood from you, you meant that it's scientific knowledge, but savoir, as far as I know, is the articulation of an enunciation and a visibility. So it's a savoir éduquer, savoir emprisonner, savoir élever. So it's not really knowledge in the sense of modern knowledge like science and stuff like
It's
that.
savoir-faire.
It's a savoir-faire.
It's not. I don't think it is because it implies what Foucault calls also often techniques. It's already, technologies. This is
of the body and.
But a savoir-faire would be still sort of spontaneous, unreflected knowledge. I think Foucault has a very rigorous epistemology, which never changed.
And the reading of the savoir is not just a spontaneous way to do it. It is the expression of power.
Of course. But I think it's a very broad term that includes. I mean, I agree. It includes the savoir-faire aspect of knowledge, but it also includes, and it's above all includes the nexus of scientific knowledge and power. And this is precisely made strong in La Volonté de Savoir. It's an epistemic drive that he describes already on the level of the title, and to talk about the science of sex, scientia sexualis. This is what he's problematizing. We never had savoir-faire on the level of desire. We always had episteme. We always had science. This is his main point when he criticizes not only psychoanalysis but also biopower. Biopower is a scientifically grounded power, I would say.
We won't solve it here, but savoir-faire might be delegated to the savoir-vivre or vivre. Thank you, Samo.